truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Thursday, September 19th, 2024, the 1,338th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening through a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month, and in doing so, you will get the ad-free experience. You'll be able to participate in the conversation over on Substack, and you'll be invited to the interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. And if you can't or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the free version on Substack, a wide variety of podcast platforms, and of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin. And you feel better about precious metals? I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company. And that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. All right, so today we're going to talk about our wonderfully fake elections and all of the revelations that are coming out about how fake our elections are. And I want to preface this by saying none of this has to be upsetting. We are in a fake election process right now. Donald Trump won in 2020 by a lot. He has all the evidence of that. He has had it the whole time. He says it repeatedly. He never conceded, and 2020 election cases continue on to this day. and we must demand accountability for the 2020 election. People did not understand the problem in 2020, despite Donald Trump telling us throughout the lead up to that election period that our elections were a problem. Many people, including myself, didn't understand the scale of the problem. And over the course of the last nearly 4 years now, we have come to understand that problem much better, primarily as the result of all the hard work of election integrity people around the country who have tried to get to the bottom of exactly what is wrong with our elections. And people have tried to create solutions and fix that problem within the framework of the governments currently in place, the governments that are currently in place due to rigged elections. I'm not going to say every politician is illegitimately sat, but I think it makes sense to assume that until it is proven otherwise beyond a shadow of a doubt. Since absolutely none of them can do that, we should assume they are all illegitimate, to then believe that the system that creates the problem they benefit from is going to be fixed from within that system seems to be wishful thinking. But again, this is not a reason to be depressed. There are other ways to fix problems. Even an illegitimate government has to carry the illusion of legitimacy. And when the illusion of legitimacy is gone, that government can't actually do anything unless it has the ability to leverage state violence against the people. The problem is, if a vast majority of people oppose them, then using state violence against dissenters is an immediate and obvious sign of an illegitimate authoritarian government, thus making the narrative problem even worse. And we've been shown that by this current regime in a variety of ways, much of it narrative. Now, it's certainly not all narrative. I have friends who have been affected by the government's overreach, their political persecutions and prosecutions, the censorship, the debanking. This government has no problem using force to achieve its political ends, but there is a point at which the people understand that, and then the regime's problem grows worse while reducing the amount of that the people will take the next time they try it. Now, I don't believe Joe and Kamala have any power to wield state violence against the people. They might have a federal law enforcement agency here or there. They might have governors within states and corrupted state organizations that they can leverage to go after people, but they don't seem to have a lot of ability to get that done. And as we've discussed many times, their power to use the media to coerce compliance has been greatly reduced, and beyond some level of control over the money and some ability to restrict access to the material aspects of their system, they don't have a whole lot of tools left. And all of that requires them having the illusion of legitimacy. They've already lost the illusion of legitimacy. People don't even believe Joe Biden is actually the president anymore. They know for certain that he's not actually wielding the power of his office unless something crazy happens in the next 24 hours. Tomorrow's episode will be about foreign policy. We have Narendra Modi from India coming to America to meet Donald Trump. We have Volodymyr Zelensky, the comedic actor in Ukraine, coming to America to meet Donald Trump. Now, both are going to show up and glad hand with Joe and Kamala and some of their pals at the UN, but then they're going to go meet the president. Not the people the global regime might recognize as the president, their puppets, their characters that they present to the world, but the man with the actual power bestowed upon him by the will of the people. I have said many times, if elections are fake, if we cannot trust that our votes are going to be counted, one person, one vote, that vote will definitely count. The reported results accurately reflect the will and intent of the American voter. If the elections are rigged and stolen, then what we have is a battle of narratives, because the part that plays out after that stolen election will be a battle of narratives to win over the collective mind in the court of public opinion. That is what is going to ultimately matter. And I would argue that we already reached that point years ago, but the court of public opinion was not prepared to properly decide at that point in the information war. So this period has gone on. And for the period to stop, that means people are going to have to wake up about their reality and demand better in order to get better. Donald Trump said he was returning power back to the people, and the people are promptly choosing to give it right back to the regime because that's what they're used to. And that's where the treats come from. That's where the rewards come from. It's comfortable and easy that way. And I totally get it. It would be much better if everything could be comfortable and easy, and we could also get our way all the time in fulfilling and moral ways. But that's not how the world works. If elections are fake, then an election is a battle of narratives. And if elections are real, meaning that all the votes are cast properly and counted accurately, the reported results accurately reflect the will and intent of the voters, then they are the product of winning a battle of narratives. So the important thing is the battle of narratives. And when Donald Trump says too big to rig, I suspect what he is referring to is that battle of narratives. Make it absolutely clear to everyone in the country, Donald Trump has a massive majority. Donald Trump had a massive majority in 2020, and it has grown since then. We are not waiting on a majority of people to approve of Donald Trump. We have had that for years now. We are waiting on a critical mass of people to understand that serious changes absolutely must be made. And that will require being honest about the problem. And that can happen now through rational conversations, applying logic, figuring out how to proceed. Or it can happen through everyone getting the hose again. And maybe I'm crazy, but I think it's better if everyone doesn't get the hose again. I think it's better to learn the lesson, understand the possibilities, and then begin thinking further ahead, already prepared to handle the possibilities of whatever might happen on the 5th of November, if indeed anything at all happens. There still seems to be a strong chance that we won't have a fake election in a month and a half because it will have been canceled. And at the point that it's canceled, people might then realize, hopefully, that a real election was never happening to begin with. So let's focus in on where the narrative is relative to the legitimacy of our elections. And I would suggest that people are learning very quickly that our elections are not legitimate. They're being told that the election coming up is riddled with all sorts of fraud and malfeasance, all kinds of problems, both built into the system and influenced from outside, from domestic actors to foreign actors, from politicians and major political organizations to people who are, quote unquote, helping out on the ground. There is a reason these stories are coming out, and it's beyond just they're true. And even if you don't buy that, even if you think there's no reason these stories are coming out, they're just being reported spontaneously when they happen. These events occur, reporters find out about them, they write stories, they publish those stories. Even if that's how you believe things operate, we cannot deny what the effect of all these stories will be. And the effect of all these stories will be that more people understand something is seriously wrong with our elections. There are stories nearly every day. Some make it into the mainstream media, some of them don't. But the number of stories in the mainstream media about widespread election fraud continues to grow. So even people who might deny that our elections have problems, who might think that our elections are legitimate and you must say nice things about our elections to protect the illusion of legitimacy, even those statists who are protecting the regime in every way they can, know that these stories are out there. They'll see these headlines in their social media. They can deny it, but it's in their head. They are aware this conversation is taking place in public. The ratio of election trusters to election deniers is moving greatly in our favor. So if we are trying to win a battle of narratives over elections, that's what's happening. And that's going to continue to happen. And if it happens too much, they might try to cancel the whole thing. And I think it might happen too much. The point is winning the battle of narratives and making the battle of narratives too big to rig, because we can't depend on the legitimacy of the election system. When the battle of narratives is too big to rig, it doesn't matter at all whether the election system is legitimate. because there is no way that they can create the illusion of legitimacy and sell it to anyone. So let's get into some of these stories. I have a bunch of them today. This was posted this morning by Kyle Becker on X, formerly Twitter, and then reposted by Elon Musk. Elon Musk wrote, "They make fraud impossible to prove." A wonderful lesson for all the election trusters out there who say things like, yeah, well, those 2020 elections were audited. If there was widespread fraud, they would have found it. The courts would have decided in our favor. The news would have told us. Becker's caption describing what you're about to hear: election officials in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania have banned all mail-in ballot drop boxes from the county over concerns that they facilitate voter fraud. How about that? Elon Musk's repost of that post has been liked 100,000 times. It's been seen by nearly 11 million people. And Elon Musk is one of the most influential men on the planet. It doesn't matter if you like him or not. He is extremely influential. People listen to him. People take his words seriously. So again, this is out of Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, a quote-unquote swing state, a quote-unquote battleground state.
Concerns again at the drop box.
A Luzerne County election official reported someone trying to drop off multiple ballots. Williams says a woman tried to put 4 mail-in ballots in the drop box at Penn Place while Director of Elections Michael Susick and another employee were emptying it. Susick, who reported the incident, says he explained that she could only drop off her own ballot unless she had the signed affidavit to drop off one other person's if they are unable, one other person's. She didn't have it, and she said she didn't have time to go to the election office to get one. Susick reported the woman started to walk away, but turned around, threw all 4 into the bag, and immediately left. Susick was able to separate the 4 ballots, which are being held in a secure location.
Now, is this anything new? Of course not. Does Elon Musk's comment about these ballot drop boxes making it impossible to prove fraud apply only to the ballot drop box situation in 2024? Or does it confirm for the people who are now open to these ideas that this was the situation in 2020? This is a claim that people rejected. They say this isn't possible. Now, with new eyes and new understanding, people see this and realize, oh, wait, that's the election system? Elections are run this way? That sort of thing can just happen? And yeah, that sort of thing can just happen. We're told that this lady tried to just throw them in the bag while people were unloading the drop box. Well, assuming that's true, I guess it's a good thing those people were there. But are all ballot drop boxes monitored around the clock so that that sort of thing can't happen? No, they're not. This is an example of the system creating opportunities for fraud while eliminating the possibility of achieving accountability for the very same fraud. Let's continue with just the news. This is from Tuesday. Arizona Secretary of State says nearly 100,000 Arizona voters incorrectly listed as providing proof of citizenship. Arizona Secretary of State Adrian Fontes, who, by the way, is illegitimately sat in his office as a product of 2022's fake election. He took that job over from Katie Hobbs, the illegitimate governor of Arizona, who ascended to the governorship in 2022, having been the Secretary of State of Arizona during the obviously rigged and stolen 2020 election in Arizona. But back to the article. Fontes said Tuesday that nearly 100,000 voters were incorrectly registered in the state as providing proof of U.S. citizenship, even though they had not done so. Fontes explained that there was an error in state systems that labeled the roughly 97,000 voters as providing documented proof of U.S. citizenship, VoteBeat reported. Arizona's Motor Vehicle Division provides the state's voter registration system with driver's license information, and the error occurred in that process. Weird, isn't it? Why would you want your voter registration system connected to the driver's license system in a state that is continuously flooded with illegal aliens? Strange. Affected voters had first obtained Arizona driver's licenses before October 1996 and were issued duplicate replacements before registering to vote after 2004, Fontes said. The error has occurred for about 20 years and over 4 administrations, he noted. So they run a tight ship in Arizona. Arizona is a state with the unusual situation of bifurcated elections, in which residents who provide proof of U.S. citizenship can vote in all elections, while others may vote only in federal elections, resulting in ballots cast by voters who haven't proven their U.S. citizenship. I asked Perplexity AI to tell me about the bifurcated elections in Arizona, and it returned. Arizona began holding bifurcated elections with separate systems for federal only and full ballot voters following the passage of Proposition 200 in 2004. This proposition required proof of citizenship when registering to vote. However, subsequent litigation led to the U.S. Supreme Court ruling that states must use and accept the federal voter registration form in compliance with the National Voter Registration Act, which resulted in the creation of a federal-only ballot system in Arizona. This system has been in place since 2013 following a Supreme Court decision that allowed voters who did not provide proof of citizenship to vote in federal elections only. Back to just the news. Governor Katie Hobbs said she ordered the MVD to fix the error and is ordering a, quote, independent audit to ensure that MVD systems are functioning as necessary to support voter registration. The error was discovered by a Maricopa County worker who found a registered voter who hadn't provided proof of U.S. citizenship, but was listed as a voter who could cast ballots in both federal and state elections. The voter had a green card, but never cast a ballot, Fontes said. Thank goodness that one person didn't do the bad thing. I'm sure this is the only example. My office discovered this issue last week, and we have been working with the governor's office, the secretary's office, the MVD, and the attorney general to fix this process moving forward. Maricopa County Recorder Stephen Richer posted on his X, formerly Twitter, account Tuesday. And Stephen Richer is the so-called Republican who helped not at all in 2022, who was actively in opposition to Kari Lake and other Republican candidates in that election. Counties are scheduled to send out military and overseas ballots on Thursday. Richer said that his office is suing the secretary's office regarding how to handle certain voters who need to provide documented proof of citizenship. Richer says, moving forward, 2025 onward, everyone agrees we need documented proof of citizenship for those voters for them to fill out a full ballot. But the secretary and I have different opinions on what the law requires for the November 5th, 2024 general election. It is my position that these registrants have not satisfied Arizona's documented proof of citizenship law and therefore can only vote a Fed-only ballot. The secretary argues that it is too close to the election to implement such a change and that it would be unduly burdensome on voters and deprive them of their voting rights. That is why we are going to the courts to get a clear answer. So we are being told that the voters could not figure out between now and Election Day how to get registered to vote properly in Arizona. This would place an undue burden upon them in this short amount of time. So what we're going to do is go to the courts. And if it turns out that it takes too long for the courts to decide and the process advances past where the courts are, well, then the whole issue is just moot. Captain Seth Keshel covered this on his Substack today. You can find that at skeshel.substack.com. He wrote, Stephen Richer and Adrian Fontes, the Maricopa County Recorder and Secretary of State, respectively, who seem to view themselves as a modern rendition of Jefferson and Adams, have a quote-unquote friendly lawsuit floating around 97,688 registered voters who have no proof of citizenship on file and who are reportedly led in number by those registered as Republicans. Now, after 4 years of constant havoc over the state of elections in Arizona, we have a debate raging about whether these voters should be able to vote in state and local races, as opposed to federal only, which could jeopardize a very narrow GOP legislative majority, and he's talking about in the state of Arizona. The narrative is planted now that it is Republicans, not Democrats, who are causing issues with the integrity of voter rolls. And so you hear about the citizenship question in relation to illegal aliens, but that is reportedly not the case here. Keschel believes this might be a push to manipulate elections in the state in a way they won't for the federal elections, perhaps in an effort to take over the state's legislature in the event of a contingent election. We heard in 2020 about consent agreements and friendly lawsuits. This is what happens when officials on neither side can be expected to actually follow the law, and an issue about how much the law has been complicated and convoluted. They will enter this lawsuit and then have the court tell them this is what you need to do. This happened in 2020 in Pennsylvania, and we saw the consent decree in Georgia, which we are told was not actually a consent decree. It was just a legal settlement reached between the parties. And we know what that's called: bipartisanship, aka unipartisanship. So both sides of the uniparty agree to upend the law on behalf of the uniparty, claiming to be representing the people and their own parties while doing so. Then all they need is a compliant uniparty court, and just like that, the state legislatures are circumvented in direct violation of the Constitution. Let's go to South Carolina, and this is democracydocket.com. This is the organization of Democrat election lawfare attorney Mark Elias, who we'll check in with later. But for now, this article is from yesterday. South Carolina must give right-wing group access to voter rolls, federal judge says. The South Carolina State Election Commission must give a right-wing group access to their voter registration list, a federal judge ruled on Wednesday. The Public Interest Legal Foundation first requested access to a copy of the state's voter rolls in February, but the state's election commission rejected their request because, under a state election law, only qualified voters in South Carolina can gain access to that information. Then in March, the Public Interest Legal Foundation sued South Carolina Elections Commission Director Howard Knapp, arguing the state's law violates the National Voter Registration Act, which requires states to maintain publicly accessible voter registration records. On Wednesday, U.S. District Court Judge Joseph Anderson ruled in favor of PILF, stating that South Carolina's prohibition on the distribution of statewide voter registration lists to only eligible South Carolina voters conflicts with the NVRA's mandate that all records concerning maintenance and accuracy activities be made available for public inspection. Has the public been able to inspect the election process really at all? No, they haven't. And this organization had to sue to accomplish it, taking 7 months to get a resolution. Now PILF can receive access to South Carolina's statewide voter registration list. Over the past year, the group has sued to gain access to voter registration records in numerous states, like Minnesota and Wisconsin, ahead of the 2024 election. We have compiled the voter rolls from across the country into a database that allows us to know who is voting twice or from beyond the grave, PILF said on its website. We've used this data to sue states for failing to do effective list maintenance, such as not removing deceased registrants, duplicate voter registrations, and voters who moved to another state. Many of PILF's public claims about mass voter fraud can't be proven. This according to Mark Elias's organization, but they still succeed in sowing doubt in the election process and the credibility of results. The right-wing legal group is led by allies of former President Donald Trump, who continues to spread lies about voter fraud as the 2024 election approaches. And one of the links in that article goes to another piece in Democracy Docket from April 19th, how a right-wing legal group uses the courts to spread election disinformation. It's amazing, isn't it? They're suing so that reporters will talk about their cases, thus spreading election disinformation. Except reporters don't talk about those cases. Everybody denies that these cases are happening until they are decided in favor of the quote-unquote election deniers, and then Mark Elias and his pals lose their minds. If the courts are deciding in their favor, one might realize at that point that they weren't just suing to spread election disinformation. Something like that might indicate to you, hey, democracy docket sounds like they want to protect the uniparty's ability to hold fake elections. And of course they do. Imagine what will happen to the regime's illusion of legitimacy when people find out that their elections aren't actually real. People think power can somehow be won back through rigged elections that are already fake. The rigging, that whole process, that's meant to preserve the illusion of legitimacy of the elections. The elections are meant to preserve the illusion of legitimacy of the government. In both instances, the people are being exploited and psyoped. Let's head back to just the news. This is today. House asks 5 states to probe possible illegal straw donations to Democrats via ActBlue. The powerful chairman of the House committee that oversees election integrity is asking 5 states to open investigations into potential criminal activity in the routing of hundreds of millions of dollars in political donations to Kamala Harris and other Democrats through the fundraising platform known as ActBlue. House Administration Committee Chairman Brian Steele of Wisconsin made 5 referrals on Wednesday evening to Arkansas Attorney General Tim Griffin, Texas AG Ken Paxton, Missouri AG Andrew Bailey, Virginia AG Jason Miyares, and Florida AG Ashley Moody, saying a massive computer analysis conducted by his committee uncovered a suspicious pattern of donations from individuals with net worths too small to donate what has been credited to them via ActBlue reports to the Federal Election Commission. This investigation focused on potential unlawful exploitation of unwitting, quote-unquote, straw donors whose identities may have been used to channel illicit funds into campaigns in your state, Steele wrote the top law enforcement officials in the 5 states. The final analysis produced a set of anomalous donor profiles, ranked by the severity of the inconsistencies. In reviewing this analysis, it became clear that there is suspicious activity occurring that warrants further review, he added. Straw donors are donors who are either given money by others to donate to federal candidates or whose identity is misused by others to make donations to evade federal campaign contribution limits. The Democrat Party was rocked by a straw donation scandal under Bill Clinton 3 decades ago when Congress and federal prosecutors confirmed wealthy businessmen tied to China routed millions to straw donors during the 1996 election. That scandal, dubbed Chinagate, led to a major congressional probe and a few dozen convictions. Now, this story with ActBlue is nothing new. A lot of people have seen James O'Keefe's hidden camera videos where he'll approach houses and ask people whether they actually made the donations, recurring small dollar donations that were made in their name. And the answer is consistently no. But this problem has actually been around even prior to James O'Keefe exposing it. In fact, in 2020, at this same time, we heard about this same story. And I talked about it on Monday evening with my friend Patrick Gunnels on our show on Badlands, Hindsight 2020, where we review the news from this week in 2020. It is amazing how often it lines up. This issue was widely known, or could have been widely known, going into 2020's fake election. What other organization is tied into ActBlue? Well, Black Lives Matter. If you wanted to donate to BLM, you donated through the ActBlue portal. All that money comes in from global philanthropists or through scams like FTX or whatever, and then gets assigned to all of these quote-unquote donors who have no idea that they're donating. The system is fully rigged in every aspect. And I understand that sounds daunting. It sounds especially daunting if you plan to go in and try to fix every one of those aspects within the system being overseen by the people who benefit from our rigged and stolen fake elections. But it is not daunting when virtually everyone in the country finally comes to the understanding that our elections are rigged, and they've been rigged for a while. So all of those things about your government that you don't like, that's the product of fake elections. That's the product of them not caring what you think, because there's no way you can hold them accountable without winning a narrative battle. Winning the narrative battle on election fraud collapses the system that supports their illusion of legitimacy. And we'll skip down to the bottom of the article in Just the News. Steele said his probe was aided by information from campaign finance whistleblowers and received help from multiple federal agencies, as well as, quote, experts in money laundering, credit card fraud, and terrorism finance. And that, my friends, is very interesting. His letter described how his staff's computer analysis reviewed over 200 million FEC records spanning the last 14 years and compared donation patterns to open source consumer data, voter rolls, and political profiling databases with an emphasis on identifying suspicious trends. The chairman cited 3 specific concerning trends: donations significantly disproportionate to an individual's net worth or previous giving history, uncharacteristic donations from party-affiliated registered voters suddenly contributing to candidates of the opposing party, and unusually frequent donations from elderly individuals or first-time donors. Let's continue with this from The Federalist. This is from yesterday. Biden's DOJ threatens election offices. Cleaning voter rolls may be discriminatory. As we approach the 2024 election, states across the country are removing thousands of non-citizens from their voter rolls. Yet amid a surge of millions of immigrants crossing our border, Democrats seem intent not only on undermining these state-led efforts and leaving the election system vulnerable to potentially unprecedented non-citizen participation, but on threatening those acting to protect our republic from foreign election interference. The Biden-Harris administration has also led opposition to the SAVE Act, requiring that voters provide documentary proof of citizenship, and enacted EO 14019, under which federal authorities are allegedly working to register and mobilize Democrat-leaning voters, including even criminal illegal aliens. Worth noting that the vote held by Mike Johnson on the 6-month continuing resolution with the SAVE Act attached was rejected by the House yesterday. 17 lawmakers crossed party lines. 3 Democrats voted for the bill, while 14 Republicans voted against it. Back to the Federalist. The Justice Department's recent guidance, trumpeted by the administration's progressive allies, addresses limits on when and how jurisdictions may remove voters from their voter lists. 3 aspects of the guidance are problematic. 1, failing to give guidance on preventing illegal voting. The first is that the DOJ feels compelled to emphasize prohibitions on state efforts to remove ineligible voters just days away from the earliest start of early voting, rather than encouraging states to avail themselves of all resources necessary to identify ineligible voters and reminding states of their responsibility to remove them. The implication is that the nation's chief law enforcement agency is more concerned with policing the efforts of government officials to clean the voter rolls than that the voter rolls may be dirty. This despite states having found ample evidence of impropriety. Skipping ahead, the DOJ's decision to use such guidance also suggests it believes states are being too vigorous in their voter roll maintenance efforts and that the department is scrutinizing those efforts. And of course, they need those voter registrations. Voter registrations are the raw material for the election rigging system. The second problematic aspect of the guidance is its likely chilling effect, not only on states, but on third-party election integrity watchdogs. The guidance notes that certain list maintenance activities may violate the National Voter Registration Act of 1993. The guidance lists these activities as potentially violating the act. comparing voter files to outdated or inaccurate records or databases, taking action that erroneously affects a particular class of voters, or matching records based solely on first name, last name, and date of birth. The prohibitions of the NVRA extend to any list maintenance activity based on third-party submissions. The guidance unsubtly continues. The NVRA is mostly silent on what legitimate list maintenance practices consist of, leaving prescriptions largely to the states. The guidance leaves unclear what constitutes an outdated or inaccurate record or database in the DOJ's eyes. The article provides a few examples, but let's skip ahead. And how does a DOJ that has turned former President Donald Trump's challenges to the 2020 election into the civil rights violating election interference conspiracy of the century define a frivolous challenge? Why would we believe the department is fit to serve as an arbiter of good faith? This is a department the Attorney General had to promise wouldn't be used as a political weapon. Is the guidance intended as a threat to those who promote election integrity? And that third-party submissions thing is particularly sketchy because the election integrity groups around the country doing this work would be considered third parties. So the DOJ is trying to prevent states from using that information from those third parties, which is especially ridiculous when you consider that they already have public-private partnerships allowing third-party organizations direct access to the state's voter registries so that they can flood them with registrations. The Department of Justice is clearly trying to intimidate state governments into allowing voter fraud amid a string of removals of non-citizens, embarrassing Democrats who insist that illegal voting doesn't happen, Senator Lee said. The third problematic aspect of the guidance is what the DOJ calls the 90-day quiet period before federal elections regarding voter list maintenance practices. According to the guidance under the NVRA, any systematic removal of ineligible voters must be completed no later than 90 days before a federal election. The implication is that if a surge of non-citizens were registered to vote 89 days from an election, it would be impossible to remove them from the rolls in any systematic, quote-unquote, effort. It's unclear to what extent this guidance or the law undergirding it bears on litigation over voter roll cleanup efforts in places like Fulton County, Georgia, and Arizona. Let's continue chugging along. This is from Friday, September 13th. House Republicans break with Trump in vow to accept 2024 results. And this is from Axios. A half dozen House Republicans have so far signed on to a bipartisan letter vowing to respect the certified winner of the 2024 presidential election, according to a copy obtained by Axios. Their party's nominee, former President Trump, has refused to say if he will accept the results and continued to deny his loss to President Biden in the 2020 election. And good for him. He didn't lose. Also, he shouldn't say he's going to accept the results of the election. He shouldn't accept the results of the election. No matter what the reported results are, he should immediately be calling for full forensic audits of absolutely every bit of it. And I've said before that I think he would be well served to just take that approach and tell the nation to expect that. But then again, it's a fake election and we're not even sure we're going to have one. And by the way, I did an entire episode on that subject, whether or not anyone should say they will accept the results. It is called unacceptable results. Signers of the one-page letter vow to safeguard the fairness and integrity of America by acknowledging the election winner certified on January 6th as the legitimate president of the United States. So no matter what they do, it's going to count. They also promised to attend the inauguration on January 20th, serve as a, quote, voice for calm and reconciliation, end quote, and condemn those who, quote, endorse or engage in violence. Led by Reps Josh Gottheimer, a Democrat, and Don Bacon, a Republican from Nebraska. The letter was signed by 25 other Democrats and Representatives Brian Fitzpatrick, Republican of Pennsylvania, Mike Lawler, Republican of New York, Lori Chavez DeRemer, Republican of Oregon, Nick LaLota, Republican of New York, and Anthony D'Esposito, Republican of New York. What's going on with those blue state Republicans? Especially Mike Lawler, by the way. Mike Lawler is one of the biggest rhinos in Congress. He is one of those guys who was given his seat to prove that elections were legitimate in a state where elections are not anywhere close to legitimate. Axios, commie propaganda outlet that it is, ended the article by reminding everybody that the January 6th attack has continued to have after effects on lawmakers nearly 4 years later, with many speaking out about a surge of politically motivated violence in recent years. What surge of politically motivated violence is that? Axios also chooses, in the context of this article, to point out the Secret Service is boosting protection for Congress on January 6th, 2025, the date it is scheduled to certify the election results. So these brave rhinos are engaging in unipartisan activity to prevent America from breaking out in post-election violence. That would come, by the way, from uniparty factions, not from MAGA. Let's continue on to CNN. Why Trump's election fraud falsehoods might cost the GOP the House. This is from today by Stephen Collinson, who basically posts a front page CNN article full of unbridled Trump derangement pretty much every day. It's actually kind of amazing. Donald Trump's obsession with election fraud that doesn't exist in any significant form could drive the country into a government shutdown and may even put the Republican House majority at risk. In a fresh show of governing futility, Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson on Wednesday failed to pass a 6-month extension of government funding with a measure attached to please Trump that makes it harder for Americans to vote. You got that? The SAVE Act was going to make it harder for Americans to vote. The Republican nominee's demands for a bill that targets non-citizen voting, which is already illegal, pushed Johnson into a corner with no obvious exits, raising the possibility of a Washington crisis in the run-up to Election Day that could blow back on the GOP. And it's amazing, isn't it, how they have to still propose legislation on things that are already illegal because the already illegal things are happening and nothing is done? The gambit has zero chance of producing a new law since Democrats who control the Senate oppose it. And Johnson couldn't even get 16 of his own members to vote for it for various reasons. And you might notice the discrepancy between what I said earlier about 14 crossing over with these 16 failing to support, but I think that's 2 more members who did not vote. So he says Johnson couldn't get Republicans to vote for various reasons, including unreconcilable demands by some arch conservatives, scary, for massive budget cuts. Also so scary, which also have no chance of making it into law because of the reality of divided power in Washington. You got to love when a Trump deranged communist just straight up admits that the Democrats will not allow the budget to be cut. Johnson now appears to have little choice but to negotiate with Senate Democrats on a short-term funding measure. But given the tiny House GOP majority and Trump's looming presence, every step the speaker takes will be perilous, especially if he hopes to cling to his job if Republicans succeed in holding the House in November. Trump seems to be setting the GOP up for an intra-party fight that could turn into a disaster in November. The history of government shutdowns suggests that the party with control of the House, which has initial responsibility for the public purse, usually pays the biggest political price. And if the speaker cannot beat a deadline of October 1st to fund federal operations, the government could partially shut down. And again, all the logic here is that in past fake and stolen elections, there is some correlation with whether or not the government was shut down. No one is going to freak out about a government shutdown and punish Republicans for it and reelect Joe and Kamala and all of their friends in this fake election. The former president isn't in the habit of asking Republican Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell for advice, but the Kentucky veteran warned on Tuesday that, quote, The one thing you cannot have is a government shutdown. It'd be politically beyond stupid for us to do that right before the election because certainly we'd get the blame. That's old Mitch, always operating on principle. Ironically, Collinson writes, Trump was on Wednesday in the state where his stand could wreak the most political damage for House Republicans. He held a big rally in New York, even though he's part of a tiny minority of people who think he can deliver his birth state in November. As if something like that matters. Who cares how many people believe the right thing? It's either right or it's not right. It doesn't matter how many people agree with him, especially when the only people Stephen Collinson actually cares about are his fellow supporters of the Uniparty. More importantly, New York is also home to several hugely competitive House races that went red in the 2022 midterm elections and paved the way for the slim GOP majority. A political crisis over a shutdown that angers voters would, therefore, risk sweeping some of the most vulnerable Republicans in the country out of their seats. One of the most threatened Republican lawmakers, Representative Mike Lawler, from the state's 17th congressional district, predicted on The Source with Caitlin Collins Wednesday that the drama would end up without a shutdown and that a funding bill would pass without the voting measure Trump wants included. The reality is that we are not shutting down the government with 45 days to go before the election, said Lawler. And it's amazing, isn't it, that Mike Lawler and these New York rhinos keep being mentioned by mainstream media outlets as important Republican seats? They were granted those seats in 2022 to convince people that their elections are legitimate. They held them for 2 years. If they steal them back for the Democrats, all the people who have convinced themselves that the elections are legitimate based on the wins by these Republicans will believe in the legitimacy of the Democrats' win as well. And this is how the Uniparty functions. You can have a solidly blue state, a solidly blue district, whatever. That seat is held by one party for a long time until people get really upset with what that party has been doing. And the illusion of legitimacy for a candidate of that party winning would be a hard thing to create. So what do? They switch the seat from Uniparty left to Uniparty right. Everyone thinks the elections are legitimate. They say, oh, we're saved. Finally, we've switched from the Uniparty left to the Uniparty right. And then a few years later, they just switch it right back. And in the meantime, they create a prominent figure out of that one Republican who knew how to bridge the divide. So the case being made here by Collinson is that Donald Trump pushing the SAVE Act is going to harm the chances of Republicans down ballot to win in their elections. Apparently, he thinks that Trump voters are going to be mad at Trump for doing this. That's not how it works. MAGA supporters get mad at these representatives for not getting with the program and operating on principle and actually serving their constituents. And no one who's even friendly to America First ideas is going to go vote for Joe and Kamala and friends because of a government shutdown. That's insane. But the narrative being built here is the same narrative we heard after the 2022 midterms. Donald Trump made all these terrible decisions, and therefore MAGA and Trump supporters cost the Republicans their opportunity to fix the whole country. And Collinson mentions it in this article. He says the building showdown on Capitol Hill is far from the first time that Trump's personal political goals have threatened to hurt his party. His backing, for instance, of a cast of weak candidates in the 2022 midterms, mostly because they endorsed his false claims of election fraud, appeared to be a factor in the failure of an expected red wave. And the ex-president's antics promoted senatorial candidates that went on to lose in swing states, costing the party control of the Senate. Did that matter? Would the Senate have done anything? No, it wouldn't have. Just like the House hasn't done anything. They perform the occasional television show with a committee hearing where they tell the country about things we learned years ago. But aside from the activity of the federal bureaucracy, the agencies, and the spending and laundering of money printed by the global regime, the federal government has really done very little over these last 4 years. We weren't going to get good legislation out of a Republican Senate. The fake President Joe Biden wasn't going to sign that good legislation into law. It's the uniparty versus Trump and MAGA. This is not politics as we were taught it. This is an illegitimate government. And Stephen Collinson is reasserting the official story about the 2022 midterms that was nonsense then and nonsense now. Let's go to the New York Times from last Friday, September 13th. Harris or Trump, once again, election results could take a while. The hosts of election night parties may want to book a room for more than just one night. For the second straight presidential election, it is becoming increasingly likely that there will be no clear and immediate winner on election night, and that early returns could give a false impression of who will ultimately prevail. How about that? Just like 2020. Large swaths of Americans have changed their voting habits in recent years, relying increasingly on mail-in ballots, which take more time to count than those cast in person on Election Day. And of course, that's actually not true. There are fewer mail-in ballot requests this year than there were in 2020 in states like Pennsylvania, where it is down by hundreds of thousands for Democrats, we are told. States with prolonged vote counting processes, such as Arizona, have become suddenly competitive. And the race between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald J. Trump appears extremely close. Well, no, it doesn't. Only if you believe fake polls does that race seem anywhere close at all. And you have to kind of just sit back and marvel at the New York Times and how they don't even understand the words that they are writing. States with prolonged vote counting processes, such as Arizona, have suddenly become competitive. Yeah, it's amazing how you can turn a red state blue when you take all the time you need to create all the votes you need to achieve the election results that were determined prior to the election. If you know the results are determined prior, then whatever it is you're doing is not participating in an election, because that's not an election. It is only a process that creates the illusion of legitimacy. If a winner is not declared on election night, it will not necessarily point to failures in the process. You gotta be sure to believe that. The New York Times is going to say it as many times as the public needs to hear it to make sure that everyone agrees that the delays are not the sign of a problem. More likely, it will be the result of intense security measures required for counting mail-in ballots. You see that? They're taking all this time just to be sure that everything is perfect. And it's strange, isn't it, that the existence of these voting machines, their use, is justified on the basis that there are too many votes to count in any other way. These machines are what makes it possible to count ballots quickly and efficiently and deliver a result. But they don't actually do that, and they're totally untrustworthy, in addition to being wide open and vulnerable to manipulation. So if you already know it's going to take days or weeks to count the ballots because of delays due to mail-in voting, why do you need the machines? You have already obviated their use. Election officials across the country are trying to telegraph to voters that waiting long hours or even days for a result is not unexpected in a close election. They are eager to counter conspiracy theorists who may seize on the uncertainty as evidence of fraud or malfeasance. And yes, of course they would, because other bigger states can get it done on election night. I keep objecting to the term delays, said Al Schmidt, the Republican Secretary of State in Pennsylvania. The ballots, he said, would be counted, quote, as expeditiously as possible, and counting votes takes time, end quote. Does that sound like a faithful American patriot representing the Republican Party as Secretary of State in Pennsylvania? That sounds like something Katie Hobbs or Adrian Fontes would say. Counting ballots takes more time because there are more steps involved. A variety of security measures, including signature verification, and ensuring that voters did not also try to vote in person are required. Election officials must open the ballots and flatten them out before they can be put in a tabulator to be counted. So mail-in ballots, by the way, introduce opportunities for fraud at every level of the process and are the reason why it takes a long time to count, we are told. In 2020, the prolonged tabulation of ballots after election night was falsely seized on by Mr. Trump as evidence that the election was rigged against him. He pointed to early returns that showed him ahead in the battleground states well before all the votes had been counted. Oh, yeah, they came in overnight, and what we saw was a straight line direct spike for Joe Biden that gave him the quote unquote win in all of those states. But sure, nothing was amiss. By the time they were completely counted, he falsely claimed that Democrats had flipped votes away from him and in favor of Joseph R. Biden Jr. And does that really sound like an accurate representation of the claims made about those spikes in voters that favored Joe Biden 90% to 10% or 100 to 0? The writer says none of this happened, of course. It was instead the result of what Democrat operatives called the red mirage, the result of far more Democrats than Republicans opting to vote by mail, leading to Democrat votes being recorded later. Remember that? The red mirage? We were told it was going to happen, and then it happened, which means they were just right about how things were going to go down. It's just how mail-in ballots work, you see? And why do we need mail-in ballots? Oh, because of COVID. We've discussed a number of times on Hindsight 2020 when going back through the news of 2020, how Democrats were holding up COVID relief, trying to win a whole slate of concessions like blue state bailouts, concessions to unions, most particularly the teachers' unions, and because they wanted to institute universal mail-in balloting and universal ballot harvesting, all on the basis of the very deadly pandemic. The 2024 results are not expected to be as protracted as in 2020, when the race was not called for Mr. Biden until the Saturday after the election. Some states have improved their procedures for tabulating mail-in ballots, and election officials across the country have more experience with the process. And mail voting rates, though still much higher than before the pandemic, have declined in some states since 2020, when many voters fearful of the coronavirus saw mail voting as the only option. Well, why did they see it as the only option? Oh, right. It's because the media waged a months-long propaganda campaign about the very deadly pandemic. Now, this article is quite long. I just want to hit a couple more things. The author quotes Donald Trump saying, "We want to go back to one-day voting and paper ballots," and writes, "Nonetheless, last week, the Trump campaign released a memo seeking to temper any conclusions from early mail ballot request data, warning of a blue mirage, and that, quote, early Democrat leads in absentee and vote by mail are not at all predictive of victory on November 5th. And apparently this narrative point is the purpose of all of the early voting and mail-in voting and ballot harvesting nonsense that we are seeing from people who claim to support the America First agenda while absolutely supporting the election rigging system, which relies on all of those processes. But I know, they are working faithfully on our side so that we can vote as hard as possible in that rigged system where the uniparty controls absolutely every element of that system. And let's head down toward the end. One battleground state did change its laws to help local election officials deal with the influx of mail-in ballots: Michigan. In 2022, voters there passed a referendum that made a host of changes to the state election code, including allowing election officials to begin processing mail ballots 8 days ahead of Election Day. In 2020, votes tabulated by election night appeared to show Mr. Trump in the lead, but he ultimately lost when all the votes were counted the next day. This year, the state will most likely be able to report more complete results sooner, resulting in an earlier call. Now, Michigan has some of the worst elections in the country, and what he just described was election law in the state being changed by a voter referendum, not by the state legislature, as the Constitution requires. It is crucial to understand that if elections for political candidates can be stolen in a state, then ballot measures, state referendums, can certainly be stolen in the states. And of course, they are. The entire purpose of the ballot measure process is to push through laws with the illusion of legitimacy that cannot possibly be passed through the legislative process without the legislators being held accountable. This is just right up in your face, psyoping people to believe that they have chosen what the election results say they have chosen, even though no one wants it. Back to the New York Times. As voters await the results in states across the country on November 5th, officials are urging them not to be distracted by premature declarations of victory from any candidates. Candidates don't get to decide who wins elections. Voters do, said Jocelyn Benson, the Democrat Secretary of State in Michigan. So preemptive statements that candidates may make declaring themselves the winner are not as reliable as the actual results themselves, which our professional elected officials will be working to transmit as quickly and efficiently as possible. And this is worth paying attention to. The candidates announcing victory. A candidate announcing victory is 100% a narrative move. That is an attempt to win the narrative battle by stating confidently that you know from the information you have, you won. Donald Trump did that in 2016. And because he did that, he limited the options that were accessible to the uniparty communists. They would have to come out and say that Donald Trump actually lost and be able to immediately prove it, which they could not do without exposing their system. There are many people who believe that somehow Donald Trump and his supporters just overwhelmed the vote. But I think that that is probably not the case. It's almost definitely not the case. And that it was actually the narrative battle being won that achieved Donald Trump that victory. And if you recall, back in 2020, it was the TV that determined that election, not voters, the TV. We were told there was an official decision desk and the official Edison Reporting. Edison Reporting, by the way, they're the organization that claimed to know Nicolas Maduro stole his election in Venezuela based on exit polls. And so I said we were going to get back to Mark Elias. Let's get back to Mark Elias. We'll wrap it up on this. Here he is on MSNBC.
I am optimistic, but I am also realistic. I understand what it is Donald Trump is capable of. I think I understood what Donald Trump was capable of before, frankly, a lot of the media understood what Donald Trump was capable of, yourself excluded. You have done a real service in educating your audience, and it is something we need everyone right now in the next 49 days to educate their audience about these threats, what it is that the secretaries of state are up against. But here's the thing. The secretaries of state do have steeled backbones. The lawyers have steeled backbones. The Democratic Party has steeled backbones. We are not going to surrender our country to the threats and intimidation of Donald Trump and his supporters. We are not going to let the mobs that formed January 6th, but which were present before January 6th in places like Detroit and in Philadelphia, trying to intimidate election officials in Georgia and in Arizona. We're not going to let them affect the outcome of this election. And at the end of the day, Donald Trump is counting on people to give up. He is counting on the cynics to win. He is counting on people to say, you know what, I don't want to be part of this. But here's the thing. Everyone listening needs to make sure they are registered to vote, they have a plan to vote, and they vote. And if everyone does that, Kamala Harris and the Democrats will win.
See, if everybody goes out and votes, Kamala Harris is going to win, according to Mark Elias. No one likes her. She received no support, even from the Democrat Party, in the primaries leading up to the 2020 election. She was the worst rated vice president ever. Everything she was tasked with doing turned into an embarrassment. People believe she's a fool, an idiot. No matter what the mainstream media says, she got her ass handed to her in that debate. Mark Elias's job is to protect stolen elections. He is like the closer in baseball. He comes in at the end of the game to nail everything down. He is projecting malfeasance onto Donald Trump and his supporters, suggesting the possibility for mayhem, and then asserting that Kamala Harris's popularity will carry her past the finish line if only people come out and vote. Does it sound like these elections are going to be decided on the basis of votes? No. All they're doing is attempting to create the illusion of legitimacy. And if we understand and accept in advance that there is no way whatsoever they could win a legitimate election, then creating the illusion of legitimacy is not possible. The only way for that to be achieved is for us to help them create the illusion of legitimacy in our elections, which is why voting as hard as possible is not only not the way to win, it's actually counterproductive. And because I know that's probably going to upset some people, let me be clear. I will vote in a legitimate election. That is why I am demanding a legitimate election and using whatever small bit of leverage I have toward that end. I can still be convinced, and I'm not discouraging anyone else from voting. If me telling the truth about the real state of our elections discourages you from voting, then that feeling should be interpreted as the understanding that what I am saying is true and that we're not just going to pass this magical finish line and have everything go back to how it was before. The fight will start on November 6th, and people need to be mentally and emotionally prepared to actually deal with that battle. If Donald Trump is announced by the TV as the winner, we are still going to have to support that result. And it's probably going to be much more difficult to muster up that support or ever actually achieve the goal of having legitimate elections if the focus is only on voting as hard as possible. They cannot win and remain in power if they are unable to create the illusion of legitimacy. The focus should be on preventing that, and that can be accomplished whether the elections are real and legitimate or totally fake as they are. I'll be back tomorrow at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic, and Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening for free and would like to support the show, the best way to do that is by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can find the info stream over on Telegram at t.me/veryreasonable. The merch site is cancelcouture.com. And for all my other links, you can visit linktree.com/imyourmoderator. And I'll see you soon. Down on the range.